There's nothing more precious to a man than the laughter of his children echoing through his home. For Jacob Stone, those sounds meant everything, until the day 7 outlaws came to silence them forever. These outlaws thought they were hunting an easy target in the Colorado mountains. They had no idea Jacob Stone was a former gunfighter who'd killed more men than he cared to remember. When they surrounded his cabin with murder in their hearts, they walked into the territory of someone who knew every tree and shadow for miles. The wilderness had been his home for 15 years, and now it would become their grave. What happens when predators become prey? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the mountainsides like a gentle embrace as Jacob Stone stepped onto his porch, coffee cup in hand. The steam from his brew mingled with the cool air, creating small clouds that drifted away on the breeze. At 42, Jacob had found the peace that had eluded him for most of his adult life. His weathered hands, scarred from years he preferred not to remember, wrapped around the warm ceramic with a tenderness that spoke of a man who had learned to appreciate life's simple pleasures. Behind him, the sounds of his family beginning their day filled the cabin with warmth. Sarah's voice drifted through the open door as she coaxed their 8-year-old twins, Emma and Samuel, out of bed. Her laugh, bright and melodious, was the sound Jacob treasured most in this world. It had been that laugh that first drew him to her 15 years ago in the dusty town of Cedar Ridge, where he'd stopped to water his horse and ended up staying for the rest of his life. "Papa, look what I found!" Emma's voice called out as she bounded through the door, her auburn hair, so like her mother's, catching the morning light. In her small hands she held a smooth river stone, polished by countless years of mountain streams. "That's a beauty, little one," Jacob said, setting down his coffee to examine the treasure. "See how the water made it so smooth? That's what happens when something tumbles around long enough. All the rough edges get worn away." Samuel appeared at his sister's side, always the more cautious of the two. "Papa, why do you get up so early every morning?" Jacob smiled, lifting both children onto the porch railing, where they could see the vista spread before them. The Colorado Rockies stretched endlessly in all directions, their peaks touched with the first golden light of dawn. "Because this is when the world wakes up, son. Listen." They sat in comfortable silence as the mountain came alive around them. Birds began their morning songs. A distant creek gurgled over stones, and somewhere in the forest a squirrel chattered at an intruder in its domain. This was Jacob's church, his sanctuary, and his refuge from a past that still visited him in nightmares. Sarah emerged from the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. At 37, she remained as beautiful as the day Jacob had first seen her, though now there were laugh lines around her green eyes and silver threads in her hair that spoke of a life well lived. She had never asked about the scars that crisscrossed Jacob's back, or why his eyes sometimes grew distant when thunderstorms rolled through the mountains. She had simply loved him, trusted him, and built this life with him one day at a time. "Breakfast is ready," she announced, then paused to admire the morning view. "Never gets old, does it?" "Never," Jacob agreed, though his eyes were on her rather than the landscape. As they gathered around the rough-hewn table Jacob had built with his own hands, the family settled into the comfortable rhythm of their morning routine. Sarah had prepared flapjacks with wild berry syrup, eggs from their small flock of chickens, and bacon from the pig they'd butchered last fall. The children chattered about their plans for the day. Emma wanted to help her mother tend the garden, while Samuel was eager to check the animal traps with his father. Jacob's cabin sat in a natural clearing about 3 miles from the nearest neighbor, accessible only by a winding mountain path that he'd carefully maintained over the years. He'd chosen this location deliberately for its isolation and defensible position, though he'd never told Sarah the real reasons. To her, it was simply where they'd built their dream home together. The cabin itself was a testament to Jacob's skills and determination. Built from logs he'd cut and shaped himself, it featured thick walls that could withstand the harsh mountain winters, and a stone chimney that drew perfectly. The roof was steep enough to shed snow, and the windows were positioned to provide clear views of all approaches while remaining small enough to conserve heat. What Sarah didn't know was that Jacob had also built hidden compartments throughout the structure, places where a man might store things from a violent past. After breakfast, Jacob walked the perimeter of their property, a habit he'd maintained every morning for 15 years. To casual observation, he appeared to be simply checking on his livestock and surveying his land. In reality, he was conducting a security sweep, looking for any sign that the world he'd left behind might have found him. Behind the woodshed, concealed beneath a carefully constructed false floor, lay Jacob's most closely guarded secret. The hidden gun cache contained weapons he'd hoped never to touch again. A pair of Colt .45 revolvers with worn grips that had once been famous from Texas to Montana, a Winchester rifle that had never missed its target, and boxes of ammunition kept carefully dry and ready. The guns were cleaned and oiled regularly, not out of nostalgia, but from the soldiers' understanding that unready weapons were worse than no weapons at all. Jacob Stone had not always been a peaceful mountain man. 20 years ago, he'd been known by a different reputation entirely. Some had called him the fastest gun in the West. Others had whispered that he was a killer who hired out to the highest bidder. The truth, as it often was, lay somewhere in between. Jacob had been many things: a cavalry scout, a town marshal, a bounty hunter, but above all, he'd been a man trying to survive in a world where violence was currency and reputation meant the difference between life and death. The scars on his body told the story of that life. A bullet wound in his left shoulder from a bank robber in Dodge City, a knife scar along his ribs from a card cheat in Tombstone, and a jagged mark on his thigh from an Apache arrow during his cavalry days. Each mark was a reminder of choices made and prices paid, but also of lessons learned about the true cost of violence. It was his younger brother Michael's death that had finally driven Jacob to abandon that life. Michael had been everything Jacob was not: gentle, scholarly, destined for the ministry. When a corrupt sheriff had gunned down Michael in cold blood over a land dispute, Jacob had tracked the man across 3 territories before finding him in a saloon in Durango. The confrontation had been swift and final, but it had also been Jacob's last act as a gunfighter. The taste of revenge had been bitter, leaving him empty rather than satisfied. That was when Jacob had ridden into the mountains, seeking solitude and perhaps redemption. He'd built this cabin with his own hands, clearing the land and learning to live off what nature provided. For the first few years, he'd been alone with his ghosts and his guilt, slowly healing from wounds that went far deeper than scars on his flesh. Then Sarah had come into his life like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. She'd been traveling with a wagon train that had lost its way, and Jacob had guided them back to the main trail. But Sarah had lingered, drawn by something she saw in the quiet mountain man. Their courtship had been gentle and patient, 2 people learning to trust again after life had knocked them both down. When they married, Jacob had sworn to himself that his violent past was buried forever. The twins had completed their transformation, watching Emma and Samuel grow, teaching them to read and write, showing them how to live in harmony with the wilderness. These simple acts had given Jacob's life meaning, in a way that all his reputation and skill with weapons never could. He was no longer Jacob Stone, the gunfighter. He was papa, husband, and protector of something infinitely more valuable than his own life. As Jacob completed his morning rounds, he noticed the horses in their small pasture seemed restless. The animals had always been good indicators of danger, their senses far sharper than human perception. A chill ran down his spine as he remembered similar signs from his past. The quiet before violence erupted, but as he looked back at his cabin, where smoke curled peacefully from the chimney and his family prepared for another ordinary day, Jacob pushed the worry aside. Those days were behind him now. He'd built something good here, something worth protecting, and he refused to let old paranoia destroy the peace he'd worked so hard to achieve. He could not have known that 20 miles away, 7 hard men were already riding toward his mountain sanctuary. following a trail that had taken them months to uncover. He could not have known that his past had finally come calling. Drawn by a weathered wanted poster that still bore his name and a bounty that had never been claimed, the morning sun climbed higher, burning off the mist and promising another beautiful day in the mountains. Jacob Stone finished his coffee, kissed his wife goodbye, and prepared to teach his son about tracking and trapping. It would be the last normal day his family would know for a very long time. The sound came just after dawn, horses' hooves on stone, muffled but unmistakable to ears that had spent years listening for such things. Jacob's eyes snapped open in the pre-dawn darkness, his body instantly alert, despite having been deep in sleep moments before. Beside him, Sarah stirred but didn't wake, her breathing still deep and regular. Moving with practiced silence, Jacob slipped from bed and padded to the window. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, providing enough illumination to see shapes moving among the trees. 7 riders spread in a careful formation that spoke of military training or extensive outlaw experience. They moved with purpose, not the casual gait of travelers seeking shelter. Jacob's blood turned cold as the reality hit him. After 15 years of peace, his past had finally caught up with him. He dressed quickly, his mind racing through possibilities and preparations. In the kitchen, he retrieved a blood-stained letter from its hiding place behind the flour barrel, a message that had arrived 3 days ago, delivered by a stranger who'd ridden off without waiting for a response. Jacob had hoped it was someone's idea of a cruel joke, but the approaching riders confirmed his worst fears. The letter was brief and to the point. Jacob Stone, the bounty stands at $5,000, dead or alive. Your family too for harboring a wanted man. You got 3 days to make peace with your maker. The Durango 7. Jacob's hands trembled slightly as he read the words again. The Durango 7 were legendary in their ruthlessness, a group of former Confederate soldiers turned outlaws who specialized in tracking down men with prices on their heads. They never failed to collect, and they never left witnesses. The fact that they'd found him after all these years meant someone with serious money and a long memory had hired them. Outside, the riders had positioned themselves in a rough circle around the cabin, staying just within rifle range, but far enough back to avoid easy shots. They knew their business, these men. Jacob counted 7 distinct positions, each chosen to provide cover, while maintaining a clear field of fire toward the cabin. A voice called out across the clearing, rough and commanding. "Jacob Stone, we know you're in there. Come on out, and we'll make this quick." Sarah sat up in bed, instantly alert. "Jacob, what's happening?" He moved quickly to her side, his voice low and urgent. "Listen to me carefully. Take the children and get to the root cellar. There's a hidden panel behind the potato bins. Push on the 3rd board from the left. Inside, you'll find supplies and a rifle. Stay there no matter what you hear, understand?" Her green eyes searched his face, seeing something there that terrified her more than the strangers outside. "Jacob, who are these men?" "People from my past," he said simply. "Go now. Keep the children quiet." Sarah nodded, her face pale but determined. She'd always known this day might come, had seen it in Jacob's nightmares and the way his eyes sometimes scanned the horizon. Without another word, she slipped from the room to wake Emma and Samuel. Jacob moved to his hidden cache behind the woodshed, his fingers working quickly to reveal the carefully maintained arsenal beneath. The twin Colts felt heavy and familiar in his hands, their weight bringing back muscle memory from years of practice and deadly encounters. He checked the loads, spun the cylinders, and holstered them with movements that spoke of thousands of repetitions. "Stone." The voice called again, closer now. "We ain't got all day. You come out peaceful-like, and maybe we'll make it quick for your woman and young ones, too." Through the window, Jacob could see their leader now, a tall, lean man with a salt-and-pepper beard, and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Something about him seemed familiar, though Jacob couldn't place the face in the dim morning light. "I know you can hear me, Stone." The man continued. "Name's Sheriff William Clayton, though I doubt you remember me. But I sure as hell remember you. Been looking forward to this for a long time." The name hit Jacob like a physical blow. Sheriff William Clayton, the corrupt lawman who had murdered his brother Michael 20 years ago. The man Jacob had tracked across 3 territories before finally cornering in that Durango saloon. The man Jacob had killed, or thought he had killed, before disappearing into the mountains. But if Clayton was alive, then everything Jacob thought he knew about that night was wrong. Surprised, ain't you? Clayton's laugh was cold and mocking. Thought you'd finish the job back in Durango? That bullet of yours did put me down, I'll give you that. But it takes more than one slug to kill William Clayton. Spent 6 months healing up, and every day of it thinking about how I was going to pay you back. Jacob's mind raced as he processed this revelation. If Clayton had survived, then he'd been hunting Jacob for 20 years, waiting for the right moment. The Durango 7 weren't just bounty hunters. They were Clayton's personal army, assembled for this specific purpose. See, the thing is, Clayton continued, his voice carrying easily across the clearing, I ain't just here for the bounty money, though 5,000 is a tidy sum. No, this is personal, Stone. You killed something in me that night, something I can't get back. So I figure it's only fair I return the favor. From inside the cabin came the muffled sounds of Sarah hurrying the children toward the cellar. Jacob knew they had minutes at most before Clayton lost patience and ordered an assault on the cabin. Tell you what, Stone, Clayton called out. You come on out with your hands visible, and I'll make it quick for you. Clean shot, like what you gave me. But you make us come in after you, and I promise your family's gonna suffer for it. Your little girl's mighty pretty, from what I could see through the window. Be a shame if something happened to her. The threat against Emma sent rage coursing through Jacob's veins, but he forced himself to remain calm. Anger would get his family killed. He needed to think like the tactical fighter he'd once been, not the protective father he'd become. Moving to the window, Jacob called back, Clayton, if you want me, you can have me. But the family doesn't have anything to do with this. They don't even know who I used to be. Oh, but they do now, don't they? Clayton's amusement was evident in his voice. And besides, Stone, they've been harboring a fugitive. That's a crime in itself. The bounty's clear, dead or alive, and anyone who helps you. Through the window, Jacob could see Clayton more clearly now. The years had aged him, turning his hair grey and carving lines around his eyes. But there was no mistaking the cruel intelligence that had made him so dangerous 20 years ago. The other 6 men positioned around the cabin were younger, harder, with the look of men who killed for money and asked no questions. I'll give you 1 minute to think about it, Stone, Clayton announced. Then we start shooting, and we don't stop until everyone in that cabin is dead. Jacob looked back toward the bedroom, where he could hear Sarah's whispered instructions to the children. They were his whole world, these 3 people who had given his life meaning and purpose. Everything he'd built, everything he'd become, was centered on protecting them. But as he felt the familiar weight of the guns at his hips and saw the determined faces of the men surrounding his home, Jacob Stone realized that sometimes the only way to protect peace was through violence. Sometimes a man had to become what he'd sworn never to be again. The transformation was subtle but complete. His shoulders straightened, his breathing deepened, and his eyes took on the cold calculation that had once made him feared across the frontier. Jacob Stone, the peaceful mountain man, was gone, replaced by the deadly gunfighter who had never lost a battle that mattered. Clayton had made one crucial mistake in his planning. He remembered Jacob Stone as he'd been 20 years ago. Dangerous, but ultimately just another gunfighter with fast hands and good aim. What he didn't understand was that the man he'd cornered in this mountain cabin had learned patience, strategy, and most importantly, had found something worth dying for. The minute was almost up, and Jacob could see the outlaws preparing for their assault. But as he checked his weapons one final time and prepared to step into a world he'd left behind, Jacob Stone smiled grimly. Clayton wanted the gunfighter back? Then that's exactly what he was going to get. Jacob's fingers closed around Sarah's silver locket, the one she'd worn on their wedding day, a family heirloom passed down through generations. He'd found it on the kitchen table where she'd left it while hurrying the children to safety, and now he tucked it into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, he would carry a piece of her with him. Time's up, Stone. Clayton's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. Jacob moved with deliberate calm to the back window, the one that faced the steep slope behind the cabin. Years ago, when he'd chosen this location, he'd done so with an eye toward defense. The cabin sat against the mountainside, providing natural protection from the rear while offering multiple escape routes through terrain that only someone intimately familiar with the area could navigate successfully. From his vantage point, he could see two of Clayton's men positioned among the trees, their rifles trained on the cabin's rear exit. They were professionals, but they were also flatlanders who didn't understand mountain warfare. Jacob had spent 15 years learning every rock, every tree, every shadow on this mountainside. This was his domain, and he was about to teach them the difference between hunting men in open country and fighting someone on their own ground. Moving quickly but silently, Jacob opened the root cellar's hidden entrance and found Sarah crouched with Emma and Samuel in the concealed chamber he'd built for exactly this purpose. The space was larger than it appeared from outside, stocked with water, preserved food, and medical supplies. A kerosene lamp cast flickering shadows on their frightened faces. "Papa," Emma whispered, her small hand reaching for him. Jacob knelt and gathered both children in his arms, breathing in their scent, memorizing the feel of their small bodies against his chest. "You listen to your mama, and you stay quiet no matter what happens up there, understand? I'd need to go away for a little while, but I'll come back. I promise." Samuel, always the more perceptive of the twins, looked into his father's eyes.
"Are you going to hurt the bad men, Papa?"
The question cut Jacob to the core, because he saw in his son's face a glimmer of understanding, the recognition that his father was capable of violence. "I'm going to protect our family, son. Sometimes protecting people means doing things we don't want to do." Sarah's hand found his, her fingers intertwining with his scarred knuckles. "I know who you were before," she whispered. "I've always known. And I love you for who you became, not despite who you were." The admission stunned Jacob. All these years she'd known about his past and had never said a word. "Sarah, go," she said firmly. "Do what you have to do. We'll be here when you come back." Jacob kissed each of them, then secured the hidden panel and moved a heavy barrel in front of it for additional concealment. If things went badly, Clayton's men might find the root cellar, but they'd have to work for it. Back in the main cabin, Jacob extinguished the oil lamps and opened the damper on the fireplace, filling the room with a thin haze of smoke that would obscure any shooter's aim. He positioned himself near the front window where he could observe Clayton's deployment while remaining hidden in the shadows. The Outlaws had made their first tactical error by positioning themselves in a circle around the cabin. It was a standard formation for laying siege, but it meant they were spread thin, unable to provide effective covering fire for each other. Jacob had dealt with similar situations during his cavalry days. The key was to identify the weakest link and exploit it ruthlessly. Through the smoke-hazed window, he studied each position. Clayton remained behind the large boulder where he'd been calling out his demands, clearly intending to direct the action rather than participate directly. The other 6 were spread at roughly 60-yard intervals, close enough to maintain accurate rifle fire, but far enough apart to avoid being caught in a single counterattack. The youngest of the Outlaws, positioned behind a fallen log to Jacob's left, kept shifting nervously, occasionally exposing his position. Green, inexperienced, probably brought along for his quick draw rather than his tactical sense. He would be first. Jacob moved to the cabin's side window, the one that offered the best angle on the nervous gunman's position. The range was about 70 yards, an easy shot with the Winchester, but Jacob wanted to make a statement with his opening move. He drew one of his Colts, feeling the familiar weight and balance of the weapon that had served him faithfully for 2 decades. The shot came without warning, a single, precise report that echoed off the mountain walls. The young outlaw's hat flew from his head as he dove for better cover, the bullet passing so close to his scalp that it parted his hair. Jacob had deliberately missed, but by inches rather than feet. The message was clear. I can hit what I aim at, and next time I might not be so generous. What the hell? Clayton's voice carried a note of surprise. From his position, he couldn't see exactly what had happened, only that one of his men was suddenly scrambling for deeper cover. "He's got us ranged, Sheriff," the young gunman called out, his voice cracking with fear. "That shot came within an inch of taking my head off." Jacob smiled grimly as he watched the subtle shift in the outlaws' positions. They were no longer dealing with a cornered farmer. They were facing someone who could put a bullet exactly where he wanted it from significant distance. The psychological impact of that near miss would spread through their ranks, making them more cautious, more prone to mistakes. From behind a stand of pine trees, another of Clayton's men opened fire on the cabin, his shots splintering the logs near where Jacob had been positioned moments before. But Jacob had already moved, using the smoke and shadows inside the cabin to relocate to a different window. He returned fire, not at the shooter but at a large branch directly above the man's head. The branch, weakened by a recent storm, came crashing down, forcing the outlaw to abandon his position in a shower of pine needles and cursing. "He's playing with us!" Another voice called out, frustration evident. Clayton's response was swift and brutal. "Any man who breaks cover without orders gets shot by me personally. Stone's just one man, and we've got him surrounded. Use your heads and stop letting him spook you." But Jacob could hear the doubt creeping into Clayton's voice. The sheriff had expected a quick, decisive action. Corner the target, demand surrender, and either collect a captive or a corpse. Instead, he was facing an opponent who seemed to anticipate their every move. Jacob's next shot took the hat off another outlaw, this one positioned near the corral. Again, the bullet passed close enough to draw blood from the man's ear, close enough to demonstrate lethal accuracy, while stopping just short of murder. This was psychological warfare at its most effective, making the enemy question their own safety while demonstrating the futility of their current positions. "Damn it, Clayton," the hatless outlaw shouted. "This ain't what you promised. You said he'd gone soft, turned into some kind of mountain hermit. This man's picking us apart." Jacob reloaded methodically, his movements automatic from years of practice. Each shot had been calculated not just for physical effect, but for psychological impact. He was facing 7 men, but if he could make them doubt their leader and question their chances of survival, he could reduce those odds considerably. The mountain man was gone. In his place stood Jacob Stone, gunfighter, and Clayton was about to learn why that name had once been whispered in fearful respect from Texas to Montana. Hidden beneath his spare shirts in the bedroom dresser, Jacob's war medal caught the morning light, a tarnished piece of brass that commemorated his service as a cavalry scout during the Indian Wars. Few people knew that. Jacob Stone, the gunfighter, had once worn the blue uniform, had learned tactics and strategy from some of the Army's finest officers. That military training was about to prove more valuable than his reputation with a gun. From the cabin's eastern window, Jacob watched as Clayton gestured angrily at his men, clearly frustrated by their inability to establish effective fire superiority. The outlaws had superior numbers, but they were fighting on Jacob's terms now, and every minute that passed worked in his favor. The memories came flooding back as Jacob studied the terrain with a soldier's eye. Colonel Marcus Webb had been his commanding officer during the Apache campaigns, a brilliant tactician who taught his scouts that terrain was more important than numbers, that patience was deadlier than speed, and that an enemy who didn't understand his battlefield was already half defeated. "What you boys need to understand," the colonel had said during one of their evening strategy sessions, "is that warfare ain't about being the toughest or the fastest. It's about making your enemy fight the battle you want to fight, on ground you choose, by rules you understand better than they do." Jacob had taken those lessons to heart, and now he was about to apply them to protect the most important thing in his life. Moving carefully through the cabin's smoke-filled interior, Jacob reached the back wall where he'd built a concealed firing port years ago, disguised from the outside as nothing more than a gap between logs that needed chinking. From this position, he could observe the two men Clayton had stationed to watch the rear approach. While remaining completely invisible to them, the outlaws were good, but they were desert fighters, accustomed to open country where visibility stretched for miles and cover was scarce. Here in the dense mountain forest, with its deep shadows and layered terrain, they were operating at a severe disadvantage. Jacob had spent 15 years learning to read these woods like a book, understanding how sound carried differently in the thin air, how shadows shifted with the sun's movement, how the wind patterns changed throughout the day. He aimed carefully and put a bullet into the ground directly between the two rear guards, close enough that both men felt the spray of dirt and pine needles. They immediately sought better cover, but in doing so, they revealed their positions to Jacob's practiced eye. Now he knew exactly where they were hiding, while they had no idea where the shot had come from. "Anybody see the flash?" One of them called out. "Nothing," came the reply. "It's like he's shooting from thin air." Jacob smiled at that. During his scouting days, the Apache had called him Ghost Who Shoots, a name earned through months of learning to fire from concealed positions, using terrain and shadow to mask both muzzle flash and gun smoke. It was a skill that had kept him alive through dozens of engagements, and it was serving him well now. From the front of the cabin came the sound of splintering wood as Clayton's patience finally ran out. "Burn him out," the sheriff commanded. "Thompson, you and Miller work your way around to the side. Jameson, keep putting rounds through that front window. The rest of you lay down covering fire while Thompson gets close enough to throw a torch." Jacob had been expecting this move. Fire was the classic response when a defender couldn't be dislodged by conventional means, but it was also predictable. As he watched Thompson, a stocky man with a full beard, begin working his way through the trees toward the cabin's side wall, Jacob prepared his counter. The outlaw moved carefully but not silently, his boots crunching on fallen pine needles and his breathing audible in the thin mountain air. 20 yards from the cabin, Thompson paused to light a bundle of dry grass and pine branches, the makeshift torch flaring to life in his hands. That's when Jacob struck. His shot took Thompson through the shoulder, spinning the man around and sending the flaming torch flying into a patch of snow where it hissed and died. Thompson's scream of pain and surprise echoed off the mountain walls, and Jacob immediately shifted position to avoid the return fire he knew was coming. "Thompson's hit," Miller called out from his position. "Shoulder wound, but he's alive. Get him back here," Clayton ordered, his voice tight with anger. "Johnson, Taylor, you two try the back approach. And this time, don't bunch up like amateurs." Jacob was already moving, using a route through the cabin that he'd planned years ago for exactly this situation. He reached the rear window just as Johnson and Taylor began their approach, moving in a wide arc that they thought would keep them out of his line of sight. But Jacob wasn't just defending the cabin, he was hunting, slipping out through the concealed exit he'd built into the cabin's rear wall. Jacob began working his way through the forest, using skills learned from both his cavalry training and years of observation. He moved like a shadow, placing each foot carefully, using the natural sounds of the mountain to mask his approach. Johnson was the first to die. The outlaw never saw Jacob coming. One moment he was creeping through the undergrowth, rifle ready, eyes scanning the cabin for targets. The next, Jacob's knife, thrown with deadly accuracy from 15 feet away, buried itself in his chest. Johnson dropped without a sound, his weapon clattering uselessly among the pine needles. Taylor heard the noise and turned, bringing his rifle up in a smooth motion that spoke of long practice. He was fast, but Jacob was faster and infinitely more experienced. The Colt appeared in Jacob's hand as if by magic, and his shot took Taylor center mass before the outlaw could complete his turn. 2 down, 5 to go. Jacob retrieved his knife and quickly searched both bodies, finding ammunition and a leather pouch containing what looked like official documents. He pocketed the papers without reading them. There would be time for that later, if he survived. From the direction of the cabin came shouts of confusion and anger as Clayton realized 2 of his men weren't responding to his calls. The psychological pressure was building, and Jacob could hear it in their voices, the growing uncertainty, the beginning of fear, but he also knew that Clayton was too experienced to panic. The corrupt sheriff would regroup, reassess, and come up with a new plan. And that new plan would likely involve more direct action, less patience, and greater risk to Sarah and the children hidden in the cellar. Jacob made his way back toward the cabin, through a route that would bring him out near Clayton's position. It was time to take this fight directly to the man who had started it, to end the threat to his family once and for all. The war medal in his dresser might be tarnished, but the skills it represented were as sharp as ever. Clayton had made the mistake of bringing a gang war to a battlefield, and Jacob Stone was about to remind him of the difference. In the hidden cellar beneath the cabin, Sarah clutched Emma and Samuel close to her chest, their small wooden toys scattered around them in the lamplight. A carved horse that Jacob had whittled for Samuel last Christmas, a wooden doll that Emma treasured above all her possessions. These simple playthings, crafted by their father's loving hands, seemed to represent everything innocent and pure that was now under threat. Above them, the sounds of gunfire had grown sporadic but more intense, punctuated by shouted commands and the occasional cry of pain. Sarah forced herself to remain calm for the children's sake, though her heart hammered against her ribs with each shot fired. She knew Jacob was capable of violence, had always sensed the careful control he maintained over some deeper part of himself. But knowing and witnessing were different things entirely. "Mama, why do the bad men want to hurt Papa?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible even in the confined space. Sarah smoothed her daughter's auburn hair, searching for words that would comfort without lying. "Sometimes, sweetheart, people make mistakes that follow them for a very long time. Your papa made some hard choices before he met us, and now he has to face the consequences of those choices. But Papa's good," Samuel said, with the absolute certainty that only 8-year-olds possess. "He teaches us to be kind to animals and never hurt people who don't deserve it." "Yes, he is good," Sarah agreed, though her voice caught slightly. "And good men sometimes have to do difficult things to protect the people they love." Outside their hiding place, Jacob was learning just how difficult those things could be. He'd worked his way to within 50 yards of Clayton's position, moving through terrain he knew better than the back of his own hand. The sheriff had chosen his cover well, a massive granite boulder that provided protection from 3 sides while offering clear sightlines to the cabin. But Clayton had made one crucial error. He'd positioned himself with his back to a steep ravine, assuming it was impassable. Jacob had explored that ravine countless times during his years on the mountain. He knew about the narrow ledge that ran along its western wall, concealed from above by overhanging rocks and thick vegetation. It was treacherous footing, requiring absolute confidence in one's balance, but it would allow him to approach Clayton's position from an impossible angle. As he began the careful descent into the ravine, Jacob's mind wandered to the afternoon just 2 weeks ago when he'd brought Emma and Samuel to this very spot. They'd been tracking a wounded deer, and Jacob had used the opportunity to teach them about patience, about reading signs, about the delicate balance between predator and prey in the natural world. "Remember, oh children," he'd told them as they knelt beside the deer tracks pressed into the soft earth. "In nature, there's no such thing as good or evil. There's only survival. But humans are different. We have choices. We can choose to be more than our instincts, more than our circumstances." Now, as he made his way along the treacherous ledge with death waiting above and below, Jacob wondered if he was proving his own words false. Was he choosing to be more than his violent past, or was he simply reverting to what he'd always been, a killer who justified his actions with noble intentions? The sound of Clayton's voice, harsh and commanding, cut through his philosophical doubts. "Where the hell are Johnson and Taylor? They should have checked in by now. Maybe Stone got them," came a nervous reply from one of the remaining outlaws. "That's impossible," Clayton snapped. But Jacob could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. "He's pinned down in that cabin. There's no way he could have." Jacob's shot, fired from the impossible angle of the ravine wall, took Clayton's hat clean off his head and embedded itself in the boulder inches from where the sheriff crouched. The psychological impact was devastating. Clayton spun around, searching frantically for the source of the shot. His carefully maintained command presence cracking like ice in spring. "How the hell?" Clayton began, then threw himself flat as a second shot chipped granite fragments from the boulder near his shoulder. From his perch on the ledge, Jacob had a perfect view of Clayton's position. The man was trapped, unable to move without exposing himself to fire from an angle he couldn't return. It was a tactical nightmare, and Clayton knew it. "Stone," the sheriff called out, his voice carrying a note of grudging respect. "That was some fancy shooting, but you're still outnumbered 5-1. "Actually," Jacob replied, his voice echoing strangely off the ravine walls, making it impossible to pinpoint his exact location. "It's more like 3-1 now. Johnson and Taylor won't be reporting back." The silence that followed was telling. Jacob could almost hear the mental calculations running through Clayton's remaining men, 2 of their number dead, their leader pinned down by a shooter in an impossible position, and no clear way to gain the upper hand. "Listen to me." "Stone!" Clayton called out, desperation beginning to color his words. "This doesn't have to end with everybody dead. You killed my brother, your brother." Jacob's voice carried genuine surprise. "Clayton, I don't know what lies you've been telling yourself, but I never killed any brother of yours." "Michael Clayton," came the bitter reply. "Young preacher full of high ideals and Christian charity. You gunned him down in cold blood over a land dispute in Cedar Ridge." The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. Michael Clayton, his brother-in-law's surname had been Clayton, not Stone, as Jacob had always assumed. Michael, the gentleman who'd been studying for the ministry, who'd been murdered by a corrupt sheriff over a piece of worthless land. Michael, whose death had driven Jacob to seek revenge and ultimately led him to this mountain sanctuary. "Jesus Christ," Jacob whispered, the pieces finally falling into place. William Clayton wasn't just the corrupt sheriff who'd killed Michael. He was Michael's older brother. The man Jacob had tracked across 3 territories wasn't just a murderer. He was a grieving brother seeking his own form of justice. "Now you understand," Clayton called out, his voice heavy with 20 years of accumulated pain and rage. "Michael wrote to me about you, you know. Said you were courting some local girl. Said you seemed like a good man trying to leave his violent past behind. He was going to stand up for you at your wedding." Jacob closed his eyes, remembering Michael's kindness, his gentle humor, his absolute faith in human redemption. The young preacher had indeed been planning to officiate at Jacob's wedding to Sarah, had spent hours counseling Jacob about leaving his gunfighter days behind. "The night you killed him," Clayton continued, "Michael was coming to warn you. He'd learned that I was planning to arrest you on trumped-up charges, to split the reward money with some of the town council. He was going to help you get away. Start fresh somewhere else." The revelation staggered Jacob. Michael hadn't been an innocent victim caught in a land dispute. He'd been murdered trying to protect Jacob from his own brother's corruption. And Jacob, in his grief and rage, had killed the wrong man's brother while seeking justice for his friend's death. "I didn't know," Jacob said, his voice carrying across the ravine with absolute sincerity. "Clayton, I swear on my children's lives, I didn't know Michael was your brother." "Doesn't matter now," Clayton replied, though some of the venom had gone out of his voice. 20 years I've been hunting you, Stone. 20 years of living with the knowledge that my baby brother died because of your past, because of the enemies you'd made." Jacob understood now why Clayton had survived that night in Durango, why he'd dedicated his life to tracking down one man among all the countless gunfighters in the West. This wasn't just about justice or revenge. It was about a brother's love and a brother's guilt. But understanding didn't change the present situation. Clayton's men were still out there, still intent on killing Jacob's family. Sarah and the children were still huddled in the cellar, waiting for their husband and father to come home. Whatever tragic chain of events had led to this moment, it had to end here. "I'm sorry about Michael," Jacob said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "He was a good man, probably the best man I've ever known. He didn't deserve what happened to him." "No," Clayton agreed quietly. He didn't, but neither did your family, Stone, and that's what's got me twisted up inside. Michael wouldn't want me to hurt innocent people, especially children. For a moment, Jacob thought he heard the possibility of redemption in Clayton's words. The chance that two grieving brothers might find a way to end this without more bloodshed. But then another voice called out from across the clearing, one of Clayton's remaining men, growing impatient with the prolonged conversation. "Sheriff, we're burning daylight here. You want us to rush the cabin or not?" And just like that, the moment of potential understanding passed. Clayton's voice, when it came again, carried the hard edge of renewed determination. "You boys hold your positions. Stone and I got some unfinished business to settle." Sarah's well-worn recipe book lay open on the kitchen table where she'd left it that morning, its pages yellowed with age and stained with years of loving use. The book had been her grandmother's, filled with handwritten notes about Sunday dinners, holiday treats, and simple family meals that had sustained generations. It represented everything Jacob cherished about the life they'd built together: warmth, tradition, and the quiet satisfaction of caring for those you loved. Now, smoke was beginning to seep through the cabin's floorboards as one of Clayton's men had managed to set fire to the woodshed. The flames hadn't reached the main structure yet, but Jacob could smell the acrid scent of burning pine and knew he was running out of time. From his position on the ravine ledge, he could see the outline of the arsonist, a wiry man with a distinctive limp who'd worked his way around to the cabin's blind spot while Jacob had been focused on Clayton. The outlaw was methodically feeding the fire, using Jacob's own carefully stacked firewood to create an inferno that would eventually consume everything. The sight of his home beginning to burn triggered something primal in Jacob's chest. This cabin represented 15 years of labor, love, and dreams. He'd cut every log himself, chinked every gap, installed every window with Sarah working beside him. They'd planned their children's rooms in this space, celebrated their first Christmas here, weathered countless storms within these walls. "Damn it, Clayton," Jacob called out, his voice tight with emotion. "You want to settle this between us, fine, but there's no need to burn down what I've built. My family's got nothing to do with what happened between your brother and me. Your family's got everything to do with it," Clayton replied, though Jacob could hear something that might have been regret in the sheriff's voice. "They've been harboring a fugitive, and the bounty's clear, dead or alive, along with anyone who aided you." Jacob knew Clayton was right about the legal technicalities, but he also sensed the man's growing internal conflict. The sheriff had spent 20 years nurturing his hatred, building it into something that could sustain a life dedicated to revenge. But now, faced with the reality of what that revenge would cost, the lives of innocent children, some part of William Clayton was rebelling against his own plan. Moving carefully along the ledge, Jacob worked his way to a position where he could get a clear shot at the arsonist. The man was completely focused on his task, feeding larger pieces of wood into the growing flames, unaware that death was watching him from an impossible angle. Jacob's shot took the man through the heart, dropping him instantly into his own fire. The dramatic effect wasn't intentional, but Jacob couldn't deny the psychological impact as the remaining outlaws watched one of their own consumed by the flames he'd been tending. "Jesus Christ!" one of them shouted. "Where the hell is he shooting from?" Clayton's voice, when it came, carried a note of professional appreciation despite the circumstances. "Stone, that was some of the finest shooting I've ever seen. But you're still going to die today, and so is your family." Jacob began working his way back up from the ravine, using handholds he'd discovered during years of exploring the mountainside. As he climbed, he could hear Clayton issuing new orders to his remaining men, 3 hardened killers who were becoming increasingly nervous as their numbers dwindled. "Miller, you and Henderson get around to the back of the cabin. Use the smoke for cover and get inside if you can. Watson, you're with me. We're going straight through the front door." It was a desperate plan, the kind born of frustration and diminishing options. Clayton had lost 4 men to an opponent he'd expected to overwhelm through superior numbers. Now he was committing his remaining forces to a direct assault. gambling everything on a single coordinated attack. Jacob reached the rim of the ravine just as Miller and Henderson began their approach to the cabin's rear. From his elevated position, he had a clear view of both men as they used the thickening smoke to mask their movement. They were good, moving in tactical formation, covering each other's advance, communicating through hand signals rather than voice commands. But Jacob had spent months during his cavalry days learning to fight Apache warriors who could move through terrain like ghosts, who could appear and disappear as if they were part of the landscape itself. These outlaws, skilled as they were, telegraphed their every move to someone with Jacob's experience. His first shot wounded Henderson in the leg, sending the man crashing into the underbrush with a cry of pain and surprise. Miller spun toward the sound of the shot, his rifle ready, but Jacob had already shifted position. The second shot took Miller through the shoulder, spinning him around and causing him to lose his weapon. Both men were down, but not dead, a conscious choice on Jacob's part. He was walking a fine line between protecting his family and preserving what remained of his soul. Every man he killed was someone's son, brother, perhaps father. The fact that they'd come to murder his family didn't erase their humanity entirely. "Fall back," Clayton commanded, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "Watson, help me get those men out of there." Jacob could have killed Clayton then. The sheriff broke cover to assist his wounded men, presenting a clear target for several crucial seconds. But something held Jacob back. Some combination of respect for Clayton's loyalty to his men and the growing understanding that this conflict was more complicated than he'd initially realized. Instead, Jacob put a bullet into the ground near Clayton's feet, close enough to spray the sheriff with dirt and pine needles, but far enough away to avoid serious injury. The message was clear. "I could have killed you, but I chose not to." Clayton understood. As he dragged the wounded Henderson to safety, he called out, "I appreciate the courtesy, Stone, but it doesn't change anything. This ends when one of us is dead." Jacob watched from concealment as Clayton and Watson worked to treat their wounded men. The sheriff was down to 2 effective fighters, while Jacob remained unhurt and held the tactical advantage. By any reasonable assessment, Clayton should surrender or withdraw. But Jacob could see in the man's movements, hear in his voice, that surrender wasn't an option. This was personal in a way that transcended tactical considerations. The fire in the woodshed was beginning to spread, and Jacob knew he needed to end this soon. Sarah and the children couldn't remain in the cellar indefinitely. The smoke was probably already seeping into their hiding place, and if the fire reached the cabin's main structure, their concealed chamber could become a death trap. But as Jacob prepared for what he hoped would be the final phase of this deadly confrontation, he found himself thinking not about tactics or strategy, but about Sarah's recipe book lying open on the kitchen table. Those handwritten notes represented generations of women who had created homes, raised families, and passed down the quiet wisdom of domestic life from mother to daughter. Everything in that book, the Sunday pot roast, the Christmas cookies, the simple bread recipe that Sarah used every week, represented a world worth fighting for. A world where children grew up safe, where families gathered around dinner tables, where love was expressed through the simple act of preparing food for those you cherished. Clayton might believe he was seeking justice for his murdered brother, but Jacob knew he was fighting for something even more fundamental. The right to choose peace over violence, love over hatred, hope over despair. The recipe book, with its stained pages and loving annotations, was worth more than all the gunfighter reputations and revenge fantasies in the world, and he would kill every man on this mountain to protect it. The tarnished sheriff's badge gleamed dully in the afternoon sun as Clayton pinned it to his vest, the metal worn smooth by years of handling. It was a badge Jacob had seen before, 20 years ago, in a dusty saloon in Durango, when he'd confronted the corrupt lawman who'd murdered his friend Michael. The badge that should have represented justice, but had instead become a symbol of corruption and violence. But as Jacob watched from his concealed position, something about Clayton's movements triggered a memory that had been buried for 2 decades. The way the man tilted his head when concentrating, the particular gesture he made when adjusting his gun belt, the slight favoring of his left side that spoke of an old wound, the recognition hit Jacob like a thunderbolt. This wasn't William Clayton, the corrupt sheriff he'd shot in Durango. This was Thomas Clayton, William's identical twin brother and Michael's other sibling. The man Jacob had killed 20 years ago had been Thomas's mirror image, which explained why Jacob hadn't immediately recognized the face when the outlaws first surrounded his cabin. The implications cascaded through Jacob's mind as the pieces of a 20-year-old puzzle finally fell into place. Thomas Clayton hadn't been hunting Jacob for revenge over a corrupt sheriff's death. He'd been seeking justice for the murder of 2 brothers, both cut down because of their connection to Jacob Stone. "You're not William," Jacob called out, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "You're Thomas, aren't you? William's twin brother." The effect of his words was immediate and devastating. Thomas Clayton went rigid, his hand freezing halfway to his weapon. For a long moment, the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the labored breathing of the wounded outlaws. "How long have you known?" Thomas asked finally, his voice stripped of its earlier bravado. "Just figured it out," Jacob admitted. "The scar placement was wrong, and you favor your left side differently than William did. Identical twins, but mirror images of each other." Thomas laughed, but there was no humor in it, only 20 years of accumulated pain and rage. "You killed both my brothers, Stone. William in that Durango saloon, and Michael just as surely as if you'd pulled the trigger yourself." The full scope of the tragedy was becoming clear to Jacob. Michael Clayton had been the youngest of 3 brothers, the gentle preacher caught between his corrupt sheriff brother William and his law-abiding twin Thomas. When William had murdered Michael to prevent him from warning Jacob about the planned arrest, it had set in motion a chain of events that would eventually claim all 3 brothers. "Thomas, listen to me," Jacob said, stepping partially into view while keeping the bulk of his body behind cover. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I came to Durango to stop William, not to destroy your family." "But you did destroy it," Thomas replied, his voice hollow with grief. "When you killed William, I lost the last connection I had to Michael. He's buried in Cedar Ridge, and I haven't been able to visit his grave in 20 years because I've been hunting you." Jacob felt the weight of unintended consequences crushing down on him. In seeking justice for Michael's death, he created a cycle of violence that had consumed an entire family. Thomas Clayton had spent 2 decades building a reputation as a relentless bounty hunter, assembling a team of killers, all to avenge brothers who had been dead for 20 years. "The other men," Jacob said, understanding finally dawning. "They're not just hired guns, are they?" Thomas nodded slowly. "Every man who rode with me lost family to violence. Watson's brother was gunned down by claim jumpers. Miller's son was killed in a range war. Henderson's father was murdered by corrupt politicians. We're all ghosts, Stone, men who should have died with our loved ones, but kept breathing out of spite and rage." The revelation recontextualized everything about this confrontation. Jacob wasn't facing a gang of outlaws motivated by money. He was confronting a collection of broken men, united by grief and the hunger for vengeance. Each of them had followed Thomas Clayton because they recognized in him their own need to balance the scales of justice, to make someone pay for the unfairness of loss. "There's another way," Jacob said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "I know because I've lived it. 20 years ago I was where you are now, consumed by rage, dedicated to revenge, convinced that killing the right person would somehow make the pain stop." "And did it?" Thomas asked. "Did killing William make you feel better?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment, remembering the empty feeling that had followed his victory in Durango, the way revenge had tasted like ashes in his mouth. "No," he admitted. "It didn't bring Michael back, and it didn't make me feel like a better person. If anything, it made me realize that violence only creates more violence, more grief, more broken families. So what changed?" Thomas's voice carried genuine curiosity now, as if he were hearing something he'd never considered. "I met Sarah," Jacob said simply, "and I learned that building something beautiful is a lot harder than destroying something ugly, but it's also a lot more satisfying. I spent 15 years creating a life instead of ending lives, and for the first time since I was a child, I understood what happiness felt like." Thomas was quiet for a long time, and Jacob could see the internal struggle playing out on the man's weathered features. 20 years of hatred wasn't easy to set aside, especially when it had become the organizing principle of an entire life. "Even if I wanted to walk away," Thomas said eventually, "I can't. The men who followed me here, they're counting on this. They need to believe that justice exists, that good people who get hurt can make the bad people pay." "And what about your family, Thomas?" Jacob pressed. "Do you have children? A wife who's been waiting 20 years for you to come home?" The question hit its mark. Thomas's face crumpled slightly, and for a moment he looked less like a hardened bounty hunter and more like a man who had lost everything that mattered. "Martha died 5 years ago," Thomas said quietly. "Cancer. She begged me to give up the hunt, to settle down and be a husband instead of a ghost chasing other ghosts. But I couldn't. I told myself that Michael's death had to mean something, that I owed it to both my brothers to see this through. And now?" Jacob asked. "Now I realize that Martha was right. I've wasted my life chasing a ghost story, turning myself into something Michael would have been ashamed of. My baby brother wanted to be a preacher because he believed people could change, could be redeemed. Instead of honoring that belief, I became everything he preached against." Jacob could see Thomas's resolve wavering, the 20-year mission beginning to crumble under the weight of self-examination. But he could also see Watson and the wounded outlaws watching their leader with growing concern. These men had followed Thomas Clayton because they believed in his certainty, his unwavering dedication to revenge. If that certainty failed now, they might take matters into their own hands. "Thomas," Jacob said urgently, "if you want to honor Michael's memory, then end this now. Call off your men and ride away. Don't let my family pay the price for a cycle of violence that started before they were even born." For a moment, Jacob thought he'd succeeded. Thomas's hand moved away from his gun, and his shoulders sagged as if an enormous weight were lifting from them. But then Watson stepped forward, his face twisted with rage and disappointment. "Sheriff, you ain't seriously thinking about walking away from this? After everything we've been through, after all the promises you made about justice." "Justice," Thomas repeated, as if tasting the word for the first time in years. "Watson, what if justice isn't about killing? What if it's about choosing to be better than the people who hurt us?" Watson's response was swift and brutal. His gun cleared leather in a smooth motion, the barrel swinging toward Thomas Clayton's chest. "Then I reckon you ain't the man I thought you were, Sheriff. And I reckon this job's gonna get finished with or without you." Jacob's shot took Watson through the shoulder, spoiling his aim and sending his bullet wide of its intended target. But the damage was already done. The fragile possibility of redemption had shattered like glass, replaced by the harsh reality of men, too damaged by loss to accept any outcome other than blood. Thomas looked at his wounded lieutenant, then at Jacob, his face settling into lines of grim resignation. "I guess some stories don't get happy endings. Stone, some of us are too broken to be fixed, and with that—" Thomas Clayton drew his gun, not in anger or hatred, but with the weary acceptance of a man who finally understood that he'd chosen a path that led only to death. Jacob's fingers found the small silver cross in his shirt pocket, the one he'd carried for 20 years, the one that had belonged to his brother Michael Clayton. He'd taken it from Michael's body that terrible night in Cedar Ridge, intending to return it to the young preacher's family. Instead, it had become Jacob's constant reminder of the cost of violence and the weight of unfinished obligations. Now, as he faced the final confrontation with Thomas Clayton, Jacob understood that this cross represented more than just memory. It was a symbol of the redemption that had been offered and rejected, the peace that might have been but never would be, The smoke from the burning woodshed was growing thicker, and Jacob could see flames beginning to lick at the cabin's rear wall. Time was running out in more ways than one. Sarah and the children couldn't remain hidden much longer, and if the fire spread to the main structure, their concealed cellar could become a death trap. But Jacob also sensed that Thomas Clayton had reached some internal tipping point. The revelation about the twin brothers, the conversation about Martha and redemption, Watson's betrayal, all of it had stripped away the careful mythology that had sustained Thomas for 20 years. What remained was a man confronting the wreckage of his choices, and Jacob knew from experience that such moments could go either way. From his position behind the granite boulder, Thomas called out, "Stone, I want to make you a proposition." "I'm listening," Jacob replied, though he kept his rifle trained on Thomas's position. "You and me, face to face. No tricks, no tactical advantages, just two men settling this the way it should have been settled 20 years ago. Winner takes all, your family lives or dies based on who's left standing." Jacob had expected this. Men like Thomas Clayton, products of an earlier and more brutal era, ultimately believed that complex problems required simple solutions. A gunfight couldn't bring back the dead or heal old wounds, but it could provide the illusion of resolution, the sense that justice had been served according to rules both men understood. "And your wounded men?" Jacob asked. "They'll abide by the outcome, whatever it is." "You have my word on that." Jacob considered the offer. He could continue the guerrilla campaign, picking off the remaining outlaws one by one until Thomas stood alone. But that approach carried risks. Stray bullets could find their way into the cellar. The fire could spread faster than anticipated, or reinforcements could arrive to tip the balance back in Clayton's favor. More importantly, Jacob found himself respecting Thomas Clayton despite everything. The man was wrong, consumed by grief and locked into a destructive pattern, but he was also honorable in his own way. He'd spent 20 years pursuing what he believed was justice, and he was willing to risk everything on a fair fight rather than resort to tactics that might harm innocent people. "Agreed," Jacob called back. "But I want to see my family first. I want to know they're safe before we finish this." "Fair enough. But Stone, no tricks. You try to run, and I'll hunt down every person you've ever cared about." "That's not a threat, it's a promise." Jacob believed him. Thomas Clayton had demonstrated both the patience and ruthlessness necessary to carry out such a vow. The man had tracked Jacob across 2 decades and half a continent. He wouldn't hesitate to extend that hunt to Jacob's extended family and friends, if necessary. Moving carefully through the smoke and shadows, Jacob made his way back to the cabin. The fire had spread further than he'd hoped. Flames were now climbing the rear wall, and the interior was filling with choking black smoke. He had perhaps 15 minutes before the structure became uninhabitable. In the root cellar, Sarah and the children waited in frightened silence. When Jacob moved the barrel and opened the concealed panel, Emma and Samuel threw themselves into his arms with desperate relief. "Papa!" Emma cried, her small arms wrapping around his neck with fierce intensity. "We heard so much shooting. We thought, 'I'm here now, little one,'" Jacob murmured, holding both children close while his eyes met Sarah's over their heads. In her gaze he saw love, fear, understanding, and acceptance all mixed together. She knew what he was about to do, and while she didn't like it, she supported his decision. "How many are left?" Sarah asked quietly. "Just one that matters," Jacob replied. "Thomas Clayton, the brother of the man I killed in Durango. He's called for a fair fight, and I've agreed to it." Sarah's face went pale, but she nodded. "Then you finish this, Jacob Stone. You finish it and come home to us." Jacob spent precious minutes explaining the escape routes he'd prepared over the years, the hidden trail that led down the mountainside to the neighbor's ranch, the supplies cached at various points along the way, the signals they could use to communicate if they became separated. It was information he'd hoped never to share, contingency plans for a day he'd prayed would never come. "If I don't come back," he began. But Sarah cut him off with a fierce kiss. "You come back," she said firmly. "You hear me, Jacob Stone. You come back to us because we need you. Not because you're good with a gun, but because you're good with children's bedtime stories and fixing broken chairs and making us laugh when we're sad. You come back because you're the best man I've ever known, and the world needs more men like you. Not fewer. Jacob held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, memorizing the feel of her in his arms. 20 years ago, he'd been a man with nothing to lose. Now he had everything to lose, and paradoxically, that made him more dangerous than he'd ever been. I love you, he whispered against her ear. All three of you. Whatever happens out there, remember that everything I did was for love. He kissed the children goodbye, holding them each for a long moment, then helped Sarah secure the hidden panel. The fire would drive them out soon, but hopefully the confrontation with Thomas would be resolved by then. Walking back through the smoke-filled cabin, Jacob paused at the kitchen table where Sarah's recipe book still lay open. On impulse, he tore out a single page, the one containing her grandmother's recipe for apple pie, written in faded ink with notations added by 3 generations of women. He folded the page carefully and placed it next to Michael's cross in his shirt pocket. If he died today, he wanted to carry symbols of both the violence that had shaped his past and the love that had defined his present. The cross represented his failures and regrets. The recipe represented his hopes and dreams. Together, they encompassed the full complexity of a life lived between extremes. Outside, the smoke was clearing slightly, blown away by a mountain wind that carried the scent of pine and approaching rain. Thomas Clayton stood in the center of the clearing, his gun belt adjusted, his hat pulled low over his eyes. He'd positioned himself about 30 yards from the cabin, close enough for accuracy, but far enough to allow for a proper draw. The wounded outlaws had propped themselves against trees and boulders where they could watch the proceedings. Watson, his shoulder bandaged roughly, glared at both men with equal hatred. Henderson and Miller looked like spectators at a grim entertainment, their faces reflecting the fascination that violent men always showed when watching masters of their craft at work. "Stone!" Thomas called out as Jacob emerged from the cabin. "You ready for this?" "As ready as a man can be," Jacob replied, walking slowly toward his position. 20 paces from Thomas he stopped. The distance was perfect, close enough that skill would matter more than luck, far enough apart that both men would have time to draw and fire. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, 2 middle-aged men who had been shaped by violence and loss, who had followed different paths from the same tragic starting point. In another world, under different circumstances, they might have been friends. Both understood duty, loyalty, and the weight of keeping promises to the dead. "I want you to know," Thomas said quietly, "I don't hate you, Stone. I understand why you did what you did. And if I'd been in your position, I might have made the same choice. But understanding doesn't change the fact that my brothers are dead, and someone has to pay for it." "I know," Jacob replied, "and I want you to know that if I don't walk away from this, it won't be because I didn't fight hard enough. It'll be because sometimes the best man doesn't win. Sometimes justice is just about who's faster and luckier." Thomas nodded slowly. "Michael would have liked you, I think. He always said that redemption was possible for anyone who truly sought it. Maybe he was right. He was right," Jacob said with conviction. "I'm living proof of that. But redemption doesn't mean we escape the consequences of our past choices. Sometimes it just means we face those consequences with better understanding of what they cost." The wind died down, leaving the clearing in perfect stillness. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out as it circled overhead, and the fire continued its steady consumption of Jacob's carefully built life. But in this moment, in this space between 2 gunfighters preparing for their final dance, time seemed suspended. Jacob's hand hung loose at his side, fingers relaxed but ready. Across from him, Thomas Clayton stood in the same position, 20 years of planning and preparation, distilled down to this single moment of decision. "On 3?" Thomas asked. "On 3, Jacob agreed, and in the silence that followed, both men began to count. The twin Colt revolvers felt like extensions of Jacob's soul as his hands moved with deadly precision. Weapons, that had been crafted by Samuel Colt himself and gifted to Jacob by a grateful cavalry colonel after the Battle of Apache Canyon. The grips were worn smooth by thousands of draws, the balance perfect, the action so familiar that Jacob could operate them blindfolded. 1. The count echoed across the clearing as both men settled into the stance that would determine whether they lived or died. Jacob's breathing slowed, his vision narrowed, and 20 years of peaceful mountain life fell away like shed skin. In its place stood the gunfighter who had never lost a duel that mattered, whose reputation had been built on speed, accuracy, and an absolute refusal to flinch when death came calling. 2. Thomas Clayton's hand hovered over his weapon, a Navy Colt that had seen action in a dozen range wars and twice as many personal disputes. His face was a mask of concentration, all emotion stripped away except for the cold calculation required for survival. This was the moment he'd been preparing for since that night in Durango when his world had been torn apart by violence and loss. Jacob could see it all with supernatural clarity, the slight tension in Thomas's shoulders, the almost imperceptible shift in his weight as he prepared to draw, the tiny muscle twitch near his right eye that betrayed both determination and fear. Time seemed to move like honey, each second stretching into an eternity of anticipation. In the periphery of his vision, Jacob was aware of the wounded outlaws, watching with the hungry fascination of men who lived for violence. Watson leaned forward despite his injured shoulder, his eyes bright with bloodlust. Henderson and Miller had forgotten their own pain in the anticipation of witnessing a legendary confrontation. But Jacob's focus remained absolutely centered on Thomas Clayton. The man's breathing, his posture, the almost invisible tells that would indicate the moment of his draw. This was what separated truly great gunfighters from merely good ones, the ability to read an opponent's intentions in the split second before action began. 3. The word seemed to hang in the air for an impossibly long moment, and then both men moved with the fluid grace of dancers, performing a deadly ballet they'd rehearsed their entire adult lives. Jacob's draw was poetry in motion, a single, continuous movement that brought his Colt up and level in a fraction of a heartbeat. His thumb found the hammer as the weapon cleared leather, cocking it in the same motion that aligned the barrel with his target. It was a technique perfected through thousands of hours of practice, refined in dozens of life-or-death encounters. But Thomas Clayton was fast too, faster than Jacob had expected, faster than his age and the wounds of 20 hard years should have allowed. His Navy Colt came up smooth and sure, and for a terrifying instant, Jacob realized that his opponent might actually be his equal in speed and skill. The two shots came so close together, they sounded like a single, thunderous report that echoed off the mountain walls and sent birds exploding from the surrounding trees. Smoke billowed from both weapons, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, both men remained standing, their guns still extended, their eyes locked across the 30 yards that separated them. Then Thomas Clayton's knees buckled. Jacob's bullet had taken him center mass, just below the breastbone, a killing shot placed with surgical precision. Thomas looked down at the spreading crimson stain on his shirt with something that might have been surprise, then raised his eyes to meet Jacob's gaze. "Good shooting," Thomas said, his voice already growing weak as his life bled out into the Colorado dirt. "Michael would have been proud to call you friend." Jacob felt the burn along his left ribs where Thomas's bullet had creased him, close enough to draw. Blood but far enough from vital organs to leave him standing. An inch to the right, and the outcome would have been very different. Thomas Clayton had been every bit as good as his reputation suggested. He'd simply been unlucky. As Thomas sank to his knees, then toppled forward onto his face, Jacob felt no triumph, no satisfaction in victory. Instead, he felt the familiar emptiness that always followed violence, the hollow understanding that killing, even in self-defense, diminished something essential in both the shooter and the world. Watson struggled to his feet, his face twisted with rage and loss. "You bastard!" he screamed, clawing for his weapon with his good hand. "He was worth 10 of you." Jacob's second shot took Watson through the heart before the wounded outlaw could clear leather. There was no hesitation, no mercy. Watson had broken the terms of the agreed duel, and Jacob responded with the cold efficiency of a man who'd learned that hesitation in such moments meant death. Henderson and Miller raised their hands in surrender, their faces pale with shock and fear. The fight had gone out of them with Thomas Clayton's death and Watson's foolish charge. They were broken men who'd followed a broken leader, and now they were simply lost. "It's over," Jacob said, his voice carrying across the clearing with absolute finality. "Anybody else want to try their luck? Or can we call this finished?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Thomas Clayton's pocket watch lay shattered in the dirt beside his body, its hands frozen at 3:17, the exact moment when 20 years of pursuit had finally ended. The ornate timepiece had been a gift from his wife Martha on their wedding day, engraved with the words, "Until time stops, my love." Now time had indeed stopped for Thomas Clayton, and with it, the cycle of vengeance that had consumed 3 brothers and countless innocent lives. Jacob holstered his smoking Colt and walked slowly toward the fallen man, his boots crunching on pine needles and scattered brass casings. Despite everything, the threats, the siege, the very real danger to his family, Jacob felt a profound sadness as he looked down at Thomas Clayton's still form. This should have been a moment of triumph, of justice served and family protected. Instead, it felt like the final page of a tragedy that had been writing itself for 2 decades. Henderson and Miller remained on their knees, hands raised, their faces reflecting the shock of men who'd just watched their world collapse around them. These weren't hardened killers reveling in violence. They were damaged souls who'd followed Thomas Clayton because he'd promised them that their pain could be transformed into purpose, their loss into righteous anger. "What happens to us now?" Henderson asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jacob studied the 2 wounded men, seeing in their faces the same desperate need for meaning that had driven Thomas Clayton across half the continent. They were dangerous, certainly, but they were also broken in ways that violence couldn't fix. Killing them would be easy, even justifiable given the circumstances, but it wouldn't serve any purpose except to add 2 more ghosts to the collection that already haunted Jacob's dreams. "You ride out," Jacob said finally. "Take your wounded and your dead and you ride out of Colorado. Don't come back. Don't send word to anyone about what happened here, and don't even think about revenge. Thomas Clayton is dead, and his mission died with him. Find something else to live for." Miller stared at him in disbelief. "You're letting us go? After everything we've done?" "I'm giving you the same chance I was given 20 years ago," Jacob replied. "The chance to choose what kind of man you want to be going forward. Thomas Clayton spent 2 decades letting grief turn him into something his brother would have been ashamed of. Don't make the same mistake." Henderson struggled to his feet, favoring his wounded leg. Why? Why show us mercy when we came here to kill your family?" Jacob looked back toward the cabin, where smoke was still rising from the smoldering remains of his woodshed. His family was hidden below, waiting for word that they were safe. Everything he'd built, everything he cherished, had been at risk because of choices he'd made as a young man. But somehow, through luck or skill or divine intervention, they'd survived because someone showed me mercy once, Jacob said. A woman named Sarah, who could have turned away from a man with blood on his hands and ghosts in his past. Instead, she chose to love me, to help me build something beautiful instead of destroying something ugly. Maybe you'll be lucky enough to find someone who'll do the same for you. The 2 outlaws began the grim task of loading their dead onto horses, Thomas Clayton's body wrapped in his own coat, Watson's corpse secured across his saddle like a bundle of supplies. They worked in silence, their movements reflecting both physical pain and the deeper anguish of men whose purpose had been stripped away in a single moment of violence. As they prepared to leave, Henderson paused beside his horse and looked back at Jacob. "For what it's worth, Stone, Thomas wasn't wrong about you. You are dangerous, But maybe he was wrong about what kind of dangerous you are. Jacob watched them ride away, leading the horses that carried their dead companions. They moved slowly, not from any lack of urgency, but from the weight of defeat and disillusionment. These were men who would need to rebuild their entire understanding of themselves and their place in the world. The fire had spread to part of the cabin's rear wall, but Jacob was able to contain it using water from the well and dirt from Sarah's garden. The woodshed was a total loss, and there was significant damage to the cabin's exterior, but the structure itself was sound. More importantly, the root cellar and its precious contents had remained safe throughout the entire ordeal. When Jacob finally moved the barrel and opened the concealed panel, Sarah and the children emerged, blinking into the smoky afternoon light, like survivors of some natural disaster. Emma and Samuel threw themselves into their father's arms with desperate relief, while Sarah's eyes searched his face for signs of injury or trauma. "It's over?" she asked simply. "It's over," Jacob confirmed, pulling his family close. "Thomas Clayton is dead and the others have ridden away. We're safe." But even as he spoke the words, Jacob knew that safe was a relative term. The immediate threat had passed, but the deeper questions remained. How long before someone else came looking for Jacob Stone? How many more ghosts from his violent past might emerge to threaten the life he'd built? Sarah seemed to read his thoughts. "We'll face whatever comes next together," she said firmly. "All of us, as a family. That's what families do. They protect each other, they forgive each other's mistakes, and they build something stronger than any one person could manage alone." Jacob looked down at Thomas Clayton's shattered pocket watch, then picked it up and slipped it into his own pocket beside Michael's cross and Sarah's recipe page. 3 symbols now: violence, redemption, and love. The past, present, and future all carried together, reminders of who he'd been, who he was, and who he hoped to become. Time had indeed stopped for Thomas Clayton, but for Jacob Stone and his family, time was moving forward toward whatever tomorrow might bring. 3 months later, the new family portrait sat in a place of honor on the mantelpiece, capturing a moment of hope and healing after surviving their darkest hour. The photographer from Cedar Ridge had made the long journey up the mountain to document the Stone family in front of their rebuilt cabin, and the resulting image showed 4 people who had been tested by violence but emerged stronger in their bonds to each other. Jacob stood behind Sarah's chair, his hands resting gently on her shoulders, while Emma and Samuel flanked their parents with the easy confidence of children who knew they were unconditionally loved. The formal pose couldn't quite capture the depth of what they'd endured together, but it served as a testament to survival, to the choice to build rather than destroy, to love rather than hate. The cabin itself bore the scars of that terrible day: new logs where fire had damaged the original structure, a rebuilt woodshed that stood slightly apart from the main building, windows that had been carefully replaced after being shattered by gunfire. But these repairs had been accomplished with help from neighbors who'd learned about the siege and arrived to assist in the rebuilding process. Word had spread through the mountain. Communities about Jacob Stone's stand against the Durango. 7. The story had grown in the telling, as such stories always did, but the essential truth remained. A peaceful man had been forced to defend his family against overwhelming odds, and had done so with both skill and restraint. Rather than being shunned as a dangerous gunfighter, Jacob found himself respected as a man who'd fought only when fighting was necessary and had shown mercy when mercy was possible. The surviving members of Thomas Clayton's gang had kept their word about disappearing. There had been no attempts at revenge, no messages from friends or associates seeking to continue the vendetta. Henderson and Miller had simply vanished into the vastness of the American frontier, carrying their wounds and their disillusionment with them. Jacob had used the quiet months of rebuilding to tell Sarah and the children about his past. Not the sanitized version he'd shared before, but the full truth about Jacob Stone, the gunfighter. He'd explained about Michael Clayton and the tragic misunderstandings that had led to 20 years of pursuit. He'd described the choices he'd made as a young man and the prices he'd paid for those choices. Emma and Samuel had listened with the wide-eyed fascination that children always showed for their parents. Adventures. But Jacob had been careful to emphasize the costs rather than the excitement. Violence, he'd explained, wasn't glorious or heroic. It was messy, painful, and always left scars on everyone involved. "But you protected us, Papa," Samuel had said when Jacob finished his story. "You did what you had to do to keep us safe." "Yes," Jacob had agreed, "but I also had to live with the knowledge that other families lost fathers and sons because of my choices. That's the weight that comes with violence, children. It never affects just the people pulling triggers." Sarah had been his anchor throughout the process of confession and healing. She'd listened without judgment, asked questions without accusation, and had ultimately reinforced what Jacob was beginning to understand about himself, that a man could acknowledge his violent past without being defined by it. That redemption was possible for anyone willing to do the hard work of becoming better. The money from Thomas Clayton's bounty hunt had been left with the bodies, and Jacob had used it to establish a small fund for the families of men killed in range wars and feuds throughout Colorado Territory. It seemed appropriate that resources gathered for vengeance should be redirected toward healing, that money intended to destroy lives should instead be used to rebuild them. Jacob had also written letters to the surviving relatives of the men he'd killed over the years, not seeking forgiveness, which wasn't his to demand, but offering acknowledgement and, where possible, some form of restitution. Some of the letters had gone unanswered, others had prompted angry responses, but a few had led to correspondence that helped both sides find some measure of peace. The most meaningful exchange had been with Michael Clayton's former congregation in Cedar Ridge, the aging pastor who'd taken over. Michael's ministry had written back with stories about the young preacher's work, his dedication to helping troubled men find redemption, and his absolute belief that no one was beyond salvation. Reading those accounts had helped Jacob understand why Michael's death had affected him so deeply. He'd lost not just a friend, but someone who'd seen potential for goodness in him when he couldn't see it in himself. As autumn arrived in the Colorado Rockies, painting the mountainsides in brilliant reds and golds, Jacob found himself settling into a new kind of peace. It wasn't the naive tranquility he'd enjoyed before Thomas Clayton's arrival. That innocence was gone forever. Instead, it was the deeper calm that came from facing one's worst fears and surviving them, from confronting the darkest aspects of oneself and choosing to be better. Emma had started helping her mother with more complex cooking, learning to read the recipes in Sarah's grandmother's book and adding her own small innovations. Samuel had become fascinated with his father's carpentry work, spending hours learning to shape wood into useful and beautiful objects. Both children carried themselves with a new confidence, the quiet pride of people who'd been tested and had proven worthy of their parents' protection. Sarah had returned to her garden with renewed passion, expanding the growing area and experimenting with new varieties of vegetables and flowers. But Jacob noticed that she also spent time each evening on the porch, her eyes scanning the mountain approaches with the alertness of someone who'd learned that peace was something to be guarded rather than simply enjoyed. As for Jacob himself, he'd returned the twin colts to their hiding place behind the woodshed, but he'd also begun teaching Samuel basic marksmanship and wilderness survival, not because he expected more trouble, but because he'd learned that a man's past could never be entirely buried, and preparation was the price of protecting those you loved. The mountain man had found his peace again, but it was a peace earned through violence and tempered by wisdom. It was the peace of a man who'd looked into the darkness of his own soul and chosen to walk toward the light, carrying with him the knowledge that some battles were worth fighting and some things were worth dying for. And on quiet evenings, when the laughter of his children echoed through his home, and his wife's hand found his as they watched the sunset paint the mountains in gold, Jacob Stone knew that he'd made the right choices, all of them, even the hardest ones.